Nobody expected that it would work at all. We could not believe that sound alone could shift the lines on a map, yet documents, reports, and the dry entries of daily logs confirmed it. In several operations, Allied forces used ghost sounds as an instrument of pressure against the enemy. It was not a miracle weapon. It did not promise instant victory, nor could it replace artillery or logistics. But in the night, where every rustle sounded like a footstep and every whisper resembled a command, a series of carefully staged acoustic deceptions changed the rhythm of battle. The history of these episodes unfolded on two fronts, the European fields and the Pacific Islands forming a strange equilibrium of discipline, acoustics, and human reaction to the unknown. Importantly, whenever enemy combatants were captured, medical personnel adhered strictly to the established standards of first aid. Recorded procedures included wound dressing, control of breathing and bleeding, warming the injured, and ensuring safe evacuation under the supervision of medics. Europe offered a peculiar landscape for sound. Wet fields, broken forest lines, and stone villages created unpredictable echoes. Allied sound units operated like engineering teams. They selected locations for amplifiers, stretched cables along ditch lines, hid speakers beneath canvas, and set equipment on spring-mounted platforms to prevent ground vibrations from revealing direction. Their kits contained portable loudspeakers, small generators, reels of pre-edited recordings, and acetate discs with staged battle tracks, the squeal of brakes from imaginary trucks, the hiss of mortars, the voices of officers giving commands, the scuff of boots, the metallic click of safeties being switched off. Each sound sequence was built like a silent play, with rhythm and structure. A distant hum first, then silence, then a growing pattern of movement, as if a forest nearby was full of men. Finally, the climax, the simulation of an artillery battery setting up, convincing listeners that fire would soon erupt, where, in fact, there was no one. Such soundscapes were not improvised. Technical notes prescribed adjustments for wind speed, temperature inversion, and humidity. On cold, still nights, sound crawled low across the ground for miles. In misty dawns above rivers, it scattered and lost clarity. Operators conducted test broadcasts, listening from control points, a wrecked barn, a ditch on the opposite side, a dry well that reinforced low frequencies. They treated sound not as spectacle but as craft, a precise tool to fatigue the senses, provoke errors, and blur the enemy's perception of strength and movement. The evidence of its psychological impact was tangible. After such nights, advancing units moved hundreds of meters with little resistance across sectors that had been strongly defended the previous day. In trenches, they found scraps of paper requesting that medics not be fired upon during surrender, along with neatly packed personal items as if the owners had already decided to give up by dawn. During the capture and evacuation of prisoners, medical teams operated under strict protocols: primary inspection, pressure bandages to stop bleeding, application of tourniquets with time marks clearly visible, airway clearance, and immobilization of fractures using improvised splints made from planks and belts. In freezing weather, captured soldiers were wrapped in blankets and tarpaulins, given warm water in small doses, and monitored for shock. Each treatment was logged on medical tags pinned to clothing to avoid duplication or omission during transfer. These details survived in field hospital archives as quiet proof that humanitarian procedure could coexist with the tactics of deception. In one region where the front lines twisted through narrow forest roads, an Allied acoustic team established 3 sound stations. The first imitated construction, a compressor drone, the clang of hammers, chains rattling. The second broadcast the sound of marching columns at irregular intervals, suggesting not one unit but many. The third was kept in reserve for a sudden fire mission, layering distant gunshots, shell impacts, and orders to withdraw. In reality, no one advanced through the darkness. These were the acoustic shadows of units preparing to move at dawn. Intelligence gathered from intercepted radio messages, later showed that the enemy spent the night repositioning defenses, firing flares, and consuming ammunition against an illusion. On the Pacific Islands, the challenge shifted. The jungle swallowed high tones and magnified low ones. Nocturnal insects created a thick ambient wall that masked small details but amplified deep vibrations. Here, sound manipulation followed another logic, not imitation of war machinery, but suggestion of something formless and unfamiliar. The goal was to unsettle, not terrify. Recordings included slow, rising drones mixed with wind rustling through leaves, faint moans and whispers shaped to trigger uncertainty rather than recognition. Local commanders insisted that cultural and ethical boundaries be respected, no use of sacred sounds or voices that could mock spiritual traditions. The objective was to apply pressure without cruelty, and to ensure that, once enemies were captured, medical care followed immediately, without bias or delay. The medical part of this narrative remains the connective tissue of the entire campaign. When Allied detachments advanced after sound nights, casualties were found on both sides. Medics moved between shell holes and tree roots, checking breathing, applying sterile pads, injecting pain relief where protocol allowed, and writing quick notes: pulse rate, approximate blood pressure, pupil reaction. Prisoners were laid in shade, kept apart from Allied wounded to prevent hostility, and their condition reported to higher command. Records describe moments when opposing forces, seeing the precision and cleanliness of bandages on their wounded comrades, held their fire to let evacuation proceed. Such gestures were rare, but they carried symbolic weight. Even when illusion ruled the battlefield, a pair of steady hands could restore a fragment of humanity. The success of ghost sound tactics was always relative. A sudden change of wind could ruin the illusion. Disciplined troops with strong reconnaissance might endure the night unaffected. Yet across multiple theaters, these operations accumulated a quiet efficiency. Exhaustion, heightened vigilance, and disrupted sleep often led to simple mistakes: miscounting ammunition, misidentifying positions, overestimating enemy strength. The sound plans became another tool in a broad arsenal. Not decisive on their own, but powerful in conjunction with the physical and psychological strain of continuous warfare. Across continents, this remained the work of a few specialists, technicians, who neither sought fame nor symbols. They prepared schedules, cable maps, and weather tables. Their craft balanced between art and engineering, and beside them, moving through the same darkness, were medics with white armbands, carrying standard pouches filled with bandages, iodine, splints, and emergency blankets, instruments of order in a world built on noise and uncertainty. Together, they formed a paradoxical alliance: sound that destroyed confidence, and care that restored the dignity of life, even in captivity. Nobody expected that entire units would one day be trained to build illusions out of air. The first drafts of these sound operations came from technicians, radio operators, and engineers who had once worked in theaters, radio studios, or film production. When the war intensified, they found themselves in an unfamiliar role: to compose sounds that could alter the rhythm of combat. They were not artists anymore. They were tacticians of resonance. Across Europe, from the forests of the Ardennes to the river valleys in Italy, mobile acoustic groups emerged, small detachments, moving in trucks marked only with unit numbers. Inside were cables, amplifiers, loudspeakers, recorders, and boxes of acetate discs with carefully labeled soundscapes. Each recording was a scenario with a defined objective: to suggest an approaching attack, to cover a retreat, to simulate reinforcements, or to create confusion in an already unstable front line. Their work started with topography. The acoustic officers studied terrain maps the same way artillerymen studied elevation. A hill could serve as a natural amplifier, a valley as a funnel. Forest edges diffused high frequencies, stone walls threw them back. Sound, they noted, behaved like water. It flowed along the easiest path, split around obstacles, gathered in hollows. By late 1944, special manuals appeared describing field acoustic deployment. They included notes on sound direction, microphone placement, and the necessary decibel range for imitation of infantry versus armor. Experiments proved that a recorded column of vehicles could be convincingly moved across an area if the playback volume was increased and decreased in rhythm, with overlapping crossfades between loudspeakers. The realism was uncanny. During a cold night near the Western Front, an Allied sound team placed 12 speakers in a crescent along an abandoned rail embankment. The script was simple: an artificial motorcade rolling through mud with orders shouted in distorted English, German, and even Czech accents. As the playback began, the sound advanced west to east, creating the illusion of movement behind the fog. Enemy observers later reported continuous mechanized transfer and requested artillery fire on empty coordinates. In that single night, thousands of shells were wasted on an absence. The report filed afterward listed not triumph but data. Humidity, 82%. Temperature, 3 degrees Celsius. Effective sound range, approximately 1.5 kilometers. Enemy response within 20 minutes. The same method traveled east, to the mountains where front lines froze in static tension. There, the acoustic engineers faced a new environment. Echoes rebounded from ridges, producing double and triple delays. To counter that, they altered their frequencies, choosing mid-range tones that rolled through valleys without reflecting sharply. Their recordings no longer mimicked engines or weapons. Instead, they designed acoustic fogs, layers of low hum and distant metallic rhythm that made it impossible to determine how far away anything truly was. The enemy, unsure whether a camp was nearby or 10 kilometers off, hesitated to advance. These delays, sometimes lasting only an hour, could determine whether an evacuation succeeded or failed. Records from Allied archives mention specific examples where sound deception directly protected medical evacuation routes. During one night in 1945, a field hospital had to relocate under threat of encirclement. An acoustic section was ordered to mask the movement. They set up 3 playback points along the main road, each broadcasting false convoy noises in sequence. The sound implied a large motorized withdrawal along that road, while in reality the ambulances were moving silently along a forest trail 2 kilometers north. The ruse held. Intercepted enemy logs described heavy vehicle withdrawal, and their patrols were diverted toward the empty sound. By dawn, the hospital staff and over 50 wounded both Allied and captured enemy soldiers had reached the next valley safely. The humanitarian part of these operations remained constant. Captured troops, often exhausted and disoriented after nights filled with artificial noises, were still given medical attention without exception. First aid stations operated in tents with standard red markings visible from the air. Procedures were rigidly followed. Identification tags were checked. Wounds cleaned with antiseptic. Fractured limbs immobilized with wood splints or field aluminum supports. Medics kept a calm, almost ritual rhythm. Measure pulse, write time, apply bandage, move on. They worked amid echoes of sound experiments, still humming in the background. One report from a British unit noted the psychological strain not on the enemy, but on their own operators. Men who had spent nights surrounded by amplified fear confessed later to insomnia and tension. The price of illusion, even for those who built it, was high. On the Pacific Front, similar innovations appeared, but with a different tone. The jungle, dense and alive, did not allow for the long acoustic corridors of Europe. Here, sound was not used to simulate armies, but to distort sense and orientation. Allied troops used directional speakers mounted on rafts, along mangrove channels, or on small patrol boats. They played slow mechanical drones, mixed with natural noise waves, insects, birds. The idea was not to frighten, but to unsettle, to make defenders expect an approach from water while real units advanced through the undergrowth. Psychological reports describe these operations as the manipulation of expectation. In post-action summaries, officers emphasized that when the defenders finally surrendered, they were treated with care. Photographs show medics kneeling beside wounded adversaries, securing tourniquets, applying field dressings from personal pouches, and ensuring hydration with clean canteen water. Every action was recorded in medical logs identical to those used for Allied soldiers. The intersection of deception and compassion defined this strange chapter of warfare. Men trained to produce mechanical phantoms worked beside those trained to heal real bodies. In the evening, cables were checked and voltmeters clicked. At night, the ghost sounds rolled through the trees. By morning, the same hands that built illusion carried stretchers through the mud. War blurred its boundaries. Technology and humanity existed not as opposites, but as two forms of discipline. One manipulated perception, the other preserved life. Both demanded precision. Analysts later debated whether such acoustic tactics truly influenced outcomes. Some argued they served only as temporary distractions. Others saw them as early steps toward psychological operations that would become systematic decades later. What remains undeniable is the recorded detail, the meticulous charts of volume, direction, humidity, and the quiet appendices listing casualties treated, including prisoners. These archives tell a story stripped of drama, yet charged with human contradiction. Each chart, each medical entry, and each coil of used cable represents an alliance between science and morality, a reflection of how far organized minds could reach into the chaos of war. Thus, the architects of noise stood in history as invisible engineers, leaving no monuments, only traces of frequencies and signatures of care. Their work required both control and restraint. Control to shape fear, restraint to preserve dignity. In their reports, two languages coexisted: the cold syntax of decibels and the warm methodical language of first aid. Between them lay the uneasy truth of that era, that victory sometimes depended not on the loudest explosion, but on the quiet persistence of those who knew how to make others listen, or how to help them breathe again after the silence returned. Nobody expected that the echoes would linger longer than the war itself. In the years that followed, when the weapons were dismantled and the front lines became borders once more, the memory of those nights, the ones filled with fabricated sounds, did not disappear. Engineers and medics, now civilians again, tried to describe what they had built and what they had seen. Their reports remained classified for years, hidden among logistical records. When they finally surfaced, they revealed a portrait of methodical ingenuity mixed with unease. There was pride in precision, but also a quiet remorse for what those operations had required, not cruelty, but the deliberate manipulation of human fear. Across Europe, rural residents spoke of nights when the air itself seemed to move. They remembered the metallic hum that approached and then vanished, the phantom shouts that never reached their villages. For them, these events became local myths, the marching ghosts, or the metal storm without fire, to the men who created those illusions. However, there was nothing mystical. They could explain every wavelength, every echo. They understood that it had all been calculation. The exact distance between speakers, the humidity curve, the measured amplitude that made a single jeep sound like a convoy. Yet, when they tried to sleep after the war, many admitted that silence felt unnatural. Years of designing fear had tuned their perception to expect noise. Absence became the loudest sound of all. In official analyses compiled after 1945, military psychologists assessed the effects of acoustic deception on enemy morale. They concluded that while the immediate tactical gain was moderate, the psychological toll was measurable. Intercepted diaries and testimonies from captured soldiers described anxiety, sleeplessness, and confusion. Some wrote about hearing machines underground or men speaking from the fog. Most revealing was the consistency of their fear, not of a specific threat, but of the inability to locate it. The ghost sounds dissolved orientation, creating a vacuum where reason faltered. That uncertainty was the true weapon. The medical documentation from the same periods offers a different counterpoint. In hospitals established near former sound operation zones, doctors treated prisoners with routine professionalism. Every injury was cataloged: lacerations from shrapnel, dehydration, infections from jungle wounds. The reports noted that many captives arrived exhausted rather than severely injured. They had spent nights awake, waiting for attacks that never came. Fatigue had drained them more than battle. Medics followed identical protocols regardless of nationality: washing wounds with iodine, applying sterile compresses, checking pupils, and monitoring temperature. They rotated patients every 2 hours to prevent bed sores, administered broth or glucose water, and documented vital signs in narrow blue notebooks. Such procedures, executed thousands of times, embodied the unspoken rule that mercy had to coexist with deception. In those hospitals, the echo of the ghost sounds became only background noise to the hum of generators and the clatter of medical trays. On the Pacific Islands, similar archives survived. There, the records described the dense humidity, the difficulty of keeping bandages dry, the risk of infection. The sound operations had been smaller, but no less meticulous. Technicians had recorded waves hitting coral, interlaced with mechanical murmurs, to create illusions of landing craft approaching at night. Japanese outposts reacted with flare guns and wasted ammunition on invisible targets. The following mornings, Allied medics treated both their own wounded and the captured defenders with the same supplies. Photographs show hands tying bandages across different uniforms, a quiet continuity that ignored language. These acts did not erase the deception that preceded them, but they softened its edge. History preserved both sides: the artificial fear and the real compassion. By 1946, military researchers began evaluating the long-term value of such acoustic tactics. Official conclusions described them as psychological force multipliers, but emphasized their dependence on terrain and morale. The experiments were not to be repeated on civilians or in peacetime contexts. Yet, unofficially, some of the same engineers moved into communications research, studying how humans react to certain frequencies and patterns. Their wartime data became the foundation for future studies in perception, broadcasting, and even emergency warning systems. What began as instruments of illusion transformed into tools of understanding. Still, none of the reports ever forgot to mention the human element, that behind every frequency there had been a listener, frightened or alert, and that every illusion, to succeed, had to respect the boundaries of humanity. The medic's legacy followed a parallel path. In the years after the armistice, several manuals cited the combined medical discipline developed during mixed evacuations. They emphasized the principle that aid must be immediate and impartial, regardless of uniform. Many field medics who had worked through the ghost sound campaigns later joined humanitarian missions or civil defense organizations. Their habits persisted: the habit of calm under pressure, of documentation, of seeing each wound as neutral evidence of suffering rather than allegiance. They spoke little about their wartime companions, the engineers and soundmen, but they carried forward the same precision. Where the engineers had measured sound in decibels, the medics measured time and heartbeat. Both had served the same invisible purpose: to control chaos. In retrospective narratives, historians often tried to romanticize these operations, calling them the theater of sound or the invisible orchestra, but the original participants described them in plain terms. They had followed orders, calculated trajectories, tested cables, and recorded outcomes. They had also carried stretchers, wiped mud from faces, and felt the pulse of men who hours earlier had been enemies. It was not drama to them, only a series of tasks performed with care. Perhaps that is why the story endures, because it shows how precision and empathy can coexist even in the most unreal circumstances. Today, remnants of those ghost sound missions survive in fragments, reels of magnetic tape stored in archives, rusted speaker horns discovered in forests, and yellowed notebooks with faded coordinates. Researchers have played some of those recordings in controlled settings. The sounds are ordinary to modern ears. Engines, footsteps, faint orders. Stripped of context, they no longer frighten. But if one listens carefully, beneath the mechanical hiss, there is something else. The echo of a time when sound could shape fear, and when, after the noise faded, silence itself became a measure of survival. The final lessons of that era are paradoxical. Deception can be ethical if bounded by restraint. Compassion can exist within the machinery of war. The Allied use of ghost sounds did not decide the outcome of battles, but it revealed a capacity for strategy that included both imagination and empathy. The same soldiers who designed illusions also ensured that those who suffered from them received care. The same night that was filled with phantom engines often ended with real bandages and clean water. And when the war ended, what remained was not the fear nor the machines, but the quiet professionalism of those who had served both truth and illusion with equal dedication. Thus the story closes where it began, in the fog, with sounds that are no longer there. Nobody expected that the most haunting legacy of that campaign would not be noise, but the memory of silence afterward. The silence in which men realized that survival had depended not only on what they heard, but on how they chose to respond once the echoes were gone.